Hi everyone, welcome to this conversation brought to you by the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. My name is Chingaipe. Before we begin, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land from where we're broadcasting to you tonight, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and to those that are emerging, and also acknowledge any elders from other communities that might be tuning in to tonight's conversation. I'm very excited about tonight's conversation. I'm a bit of a classical music nerd myself, and I've got a very esteemed panel that's joining me to sort of unpack, this conversation around the future of the orchestra and how orchestras remain relevant, responsive, and representative. And so to talk through these issues, I will introduce our panelists to you, and I'll begin with Matthew Hoy, who's a Melbourne-based cellist, programmer, and creative producer, distinguished by acclaimed work that transforms the listener experience. Matthew has served as programming lead at the Australian National Academy of Music, music associate to Melbourne International Arts Festival, in addition as a member of the Australian World Orchestra and West Australian Symphony Orchestra. Matthew is founding artistic director of Soft Soft Loud and currently head of programming at the MSO. Hi, Matthew.
Hi, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Also joining us is violinist Monica Curro, who is currently in her 23rd year as an assistant principal second violin of the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. Monica was a member of the board of directors of the Australian Youth Orchestra and is a founding member of contemporary ensemble Plexus and co-artistic director of the Port Fairy Spring Music Festival. Hi, Monica.
Hi.
And last, but certainly not least, is Yaron Lifschitz, who's a graduate of the University of New South Wales, the University of Queensland, and NIDA, where he was the youngest director ever accepted into its prestigious graduate director's course. Since graduating, Yaron has directed over 60 productions, including live events, opera, theatre, physical theatre, and circus. Yaron is currently artistic director and CEO of Circa, and was creative director of Festival 2018, the arts and cultural program of the 21st Commonwealth Games. Hi, Yaron.
Hi, great to be here.
So I guess I'll just briefly explain how this conversation will work. I'll sort of begin by having a couple of mini interviews with each one of you, and then we'll sort of launch into a general panel conversation. And for those of you that are joining us via YouTube, you're more than welcome to submit questions to any of the panelists and direct them to them, and we'll respond to them at a later point in the conversation. So I think I might begin with you, Monica, if that's okay. Firstly, I guess if you could just briefly tell us about your own creative practice.
Well, I see myself as a small, medium, and large at the moment. I have a small trio who commissions new work from mainly Australian composers. And I have a medium regional festival, which is the Port Fairy Spring Music Festival. And then my real job, my day job that pays the rent in full, is the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, with whom I've been for a very long time. So I guess each inform the other. So there's a bit of a debate going on between, small to mediums and the majors, but I seem to sit in all three of them. So I try to bring all those experiences together when I'm programming, or when I'm playing, or when I'm talking to people.
And so how do each of these organizations, I guess, engage with new audiences?
Well, the trio, that engages with an audience who chooses to be the audience themselves, because there are some excellent lunatics out there that just love hearing new music, and they're the same people that you see them at other people's concerts as well. They're just so enlightened and so ready to be given anything, really, to experience anything particularly new. And also philosophically, they come to a concert because they want to support the creation of new work. And then with our festival in Port Fairy, we're engaging a lot with the people actually in Southwest Victoria. Had a huge community gala last year and made it the central jewel in the crown of the festival. And that had 150 people on stage, 75% of whom were from the local area, for example, sitting next to professional musicians. And so that's wonderful. And in MSO, well, MSO is that big machine that really has so many resources and so many responsibilities that go with that. And yeah, I've had some amazing experiences through the years with MSO, especially as it tries to reinvent itself and keep relevant and acquit its responsibilities.
Mm. And that question around reinvention, obviously, goes without saying, this has been a very unprecedented year in so many ways, in part, obviously, because of the pandemic. And I wonder what sort of challenges that poses with the organizations that you work with in terms of trying to engage new audiences. I mean, I'm sure, this isn't something that you would have factored into your planning and thinking.
Not at all, but I guess the lockdowns and the pandemic have been an accelerant to obviously digital content being the only way that you can present as a performing artist when all the theatres are shut. So that's been a real challenge for everybody, I'm sure. But also it's good. Like with Port Fairy, we're doing an online festival this year, and it means we'll have content forever, archival, beautifully produced content that we wouldn't have had time or the headspace to plan previously. So that's definitely an advantage. And so, yeah, we're all just, the other great thing that's happened, if you don't mind me saying, is that MSO has traditionally had a lot of overseas artists, soloists, conductors, and they're quite expensive. And this has also stopped us from being able to do that. So you'll see in the first 6 months of next year, in the season in particular, it's a lot more Australians, a lot more local artists. And I've always thought that we should have more Australian artists and kind of champion conductors and composers and soloists, young soloists, emerging artists, emerging conductors and composers. So I'm secretly really thrilled with that aspect of the silver lining.
Great.
Not secretly anymore.
If I might come to you, Yaron, and pick up on what Monica's just been talking about, which is, some of the opportunities that have been presented as a result of the pandemic. Is this something that you've seen with your work? Has the shift to the digital space created new opportunities in terms of engaging audiences?
Look, it has, but my instinct is that digital doesn't really work particularly well for circus and physical theatre. It's a medium that is incredibly actual, present, and three-dimensional. Nobody walks around with an iPod in their ear listening to circus. It's just not a very exciting thing to do. Andy Warhol said that sex and parties are the two things that you still need to be there for. And I think that circus is a legitimate third. So our task has been to kind of branch out in different directions. We put a lot of energy, first of all, into getting our house in order, making sure that things like First Nation Action Plan and Disability Inclusion Access Plan have been kind of done. We've also spent a lot of time finding new ways to present, working remotely, doing a project called Cube Studies, for instance, in Graz, Austria, and now we're working on one in South America, which works with urban art projects here, but a local team on the ground and an awful lot of Zoom rehearsals with my face enormous on a screen. And finding new ways to think about connecting. We've got shows that are happening in outdoor plastic donuts with the audience, with the acrobats inside the big sphere with the audience outside, and thinking about kind of new ways of rethinking the models of presentation. Because one of the things that I think is the most revelatory to me in this process has been watching the parts of the arts organization, particularly lots of the small to medium and independent sectors, respond with creativity and resilience and opportunism, which is exactly what everyone should be doing. And feeling like there's a part of the arts sector which responds very much like, imagine the American railroads did to the advent of the car, where they go, well, we put shows on in this building, so if we can't sell 80 or 90% of our seats, it doesn't matter. Rather than thinking we have audiences, we have data, we know how to reach people, we have the infrastructure to do that. Let's figure out what that now means, and let's find new paths to audiences and new audiences for our products.
I should go back to Monica, because just in terms of the work that you do, I understand that you've got a bit of an example to show us. You've got a video that you are going to introduce for us.
This is a short video of Plexus, my trio, violin, piano, clarinet, me Stefan Casamenis on piano, and Philip Arkenstall, who's the Associate Principal Clarinet of MSO, on clarinet. And this is a piece we commissioned from somebody who absolutely nobody had heard of, which is a badge of honour for us, who I happen to know through, I'm a Queenslander and he's a Queenslander. And he wrote us just the most stunning piece. And this is the third movement called Debugetty. So it's a hybrid between Debussy and Ligeti. But we just, for a laugh, entered the Melbourne Prize for Music, not thinking that we would get anywhere. Because we only started in 2014 and we made the finals in 2016. So this is thanks to Richard Grantham, who's the composer of this piece.
If I could come back to you again, Yaron, and just some of the work that you do with Circa, if you could just briefly explain that to our audience.
What am I doing here on a classical music channel? Circa produces contemporary circus, and we work in theatres doing our own shows, but we also do a lot of collaborations. This year we worked with the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra on the first setting of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, but also I created with my partner, Libby McDonnell, Wild Swans with Emotion 21 for the Sydney Myer Music Bowl. But we've also worked with the Orchestra National de Lyon, with the Brandenburg Orchestra. We've got settings of the Rite of Spring and Schubert songs, and we work with the Debussy Quartet on an all Shostakovich quartet program. So one of the things that I love is the ability to breathe classical music into people's bodies and into very fresh ways of experiencing it. And when we perform something like Opus, which is 3.5 Shostakovich quartets played in their entirety to 2,500 people who rise to their feet at the end, you realize the music doesn't have to be stuck behind a music stand in a conventional setting playing to an audience. And I love the kind of the clash that creates and the kind of the frisson. And I think that is, circus is one way of approaching it, but it's only one of many. And hybridity isn't the answer to everything, and kind of connection and collaboration isn't either, but it definitely, anything that unleashes new energy and kind of brings flavors and sense into the world that weren't there before is worth, pursuing, or at least investigating or thinking about.
And I understand that you also have an example of a video that
yeah, so this clip actually was designed for a project that I can't talk about, but what it does is it highlights some of Circa's recent work that involves working outside mostly traditional theatres. You'll see us working with the Debussy Quartet here, also working with 18 community artists on our show Leviathan, working outdoors in a show that gets everybody wet, and working in cemeteries around the UK with mass community choirs, dancers and acrobats from Circa, as well as other acrobats, as well as from the National Centre of Circus Arts. So yeah, if you want to play it.
I'm interested in something that you touched on in terms of your work with Circa and this idea of collaborating with community organizations. And I wonder, how does that process come about? I mean, how do you engage with these community organizations when you're coming up with works?
Look, it's extremely difficult and asymmetric. We would love to have a single answer, but of course, because it involves consultation and engagement, there's always some bit where somebody's leading the process. And of course, there's no point in engaging in a community with a community organization or program if it's just a sort of colonial act or a box ticking thing on your grant. You have to kind of genuinely find that rapport, but you can't have great rapport until you go on a few dates and until you try and figure out if you like each other and if there's any kind of complicity there. And of course, that doesn't happen often in the first project. So what we find really works for us, if I look at projects like ones we've done with schools in Brisbane with a very high percentage of refugee community young people, or some of our programs with First Nations participants, where it's second, third, fourth year where you start to create and investigate and start to dream wider. Last year, for instance, we recreated one of our works, Carnival of the Animals, in an outdoor setting in Cairns, which is it's a Circa repertoire work, but entirely on local young local circus performers. And those kinds of projects that kind of expand what you do and kind of sort of plant it inside a wider community are really amazing. But I think that the thing that I've learned is that at some point you have to give over to the process and kind of trust that there'll be this sort of genuine exchange of ideas. But generally, it usually starts as an arranged marriage, and sometimes there's a spark of kind of love and connectedness, and that's the second or third project usually. But the first one generally is someone has an idea or someone has a need, and one of us approaches the other, and that usually is a pretty cut and dry kind of experience.
And if I could bring you in, Matthew, I wonder, what does that process look like at the MSO? I mean, is there a history of collaboration with community organisations?
The orchestra has a number of different connections to community, but I think it's going to be one of the things and that we're addressing at the moment and looking to embrace more widely. I think, orchestras have in a sense thrived through through history. I think there's times when they've needed to try and survive through history, but I think to find a foothold in the future, that's something we need to further enrich and embrace this community model, and to integrate that into, I guess, art, music or classical practice that comes with a level of, I guess, some could see it as a level of assumed knowledge or context, but we have to work at ways to actually move beyond that and sort of transcend that in such that the orchestra, in effect, rather than as a platform, I guess, that brings with it a sense of cultural tradition, it becomes a place that is effectively a platform and a voice, and it's a very established large-scale model, but it is one, I think, that there's tremendous potential and possibility within it. It's really, I guess, as the entity that sort of presents itself, I guess, potentially to others that aren't necessarily of the same scale alongside it. I think that's where the orchestra really has a challenge and a responsibility to be the ones who dig deeper to find that way to connect, and to find that way to really authentically connect. I think that's one of the things, and as Yaron said, it's sort of, there's a whole lot of chording and there's this time that it takes, and with an orchestra, that's really about bringing a large number of people on that journey with you, to see. And often, I mean, the process for that often for the orchestra, I think, is that you build that somewhat incrementally. And there's conversations that we're having at the moment with other companies, arts companies that would be sort of looking at cross art form collaboration in Melbourne. The conversation is centered around, let's get one member of the orchestra and one member from your company in the room. Let's see what happens. Let's then evaluate that and then see if we can look at how we if that works, and we sort of that courting process, if you like. Can we take that further? And I guess ultimately, as that goes on, the orchestra can leverage the asset that it has in its size and the sort of scope of possibilities. But it is something that at the moment too, I think we've seen, with this, coming back to what we're talking about, this sort of current context, that artistic movements have always been called on to respond around major change. And we have to sort of be first responders, and it's important to see ourselves as that now, and sort of to lean into that with others. And it might be others that are in the small and medium and large sector, as Monica was saying. This is really an opportunity to find a way to cohabit and to support and potentially see the orchestra as a place that can, I don't want to use the word elevate those other art forms at all, but it's something about that cohabitation that I think gets us, you get a creative result and a community connection that's greater than the sum of its parts.
And can you tell us just about some of the roles that you take on at the MSO?
So I guess the role that I take on at the MSO, I come to the role myself as a performer, as a cellist, as you mentioned earlier. But also having, I guess, an understanding of, and myself having had a career sitting within the symphony orchestras of making music amongst many colleagues, but also, I guess, then sort of bringing this sense of how do you take that understanding and how do you translate that into the way, all of these tremendously capable and highly skilled artists can come together and create something meaningful, and that needs certain types of leadership and direction. There's a lot of layers, obviously, to how that works. So I guess my role at the MSO is really about how that relates to things that we're trying to do in terms of funding those goals and those aspirations, how to translate them into practical and technical terms as to what we need to actually see happen, the sequencing of all of those things as well. But really, I guess where I see myself is a person who's there as a connector. And if that's as much about making those internal connections and facilitating ways to move forward as it is external connections. And prior to my commencing in the role, Yaron working very closely with Melissa King, who was the Director of Artistic Planning, and really that dialogue and discussion around how to find that resonance and that meeting point so that you can get a really powerful kind of result like the orchestra did with Circa around the Beethoven 9 interpretation as well.
And I understand that you've also got an example to show us around.
That's right. So this example, this is one that I thought could be interesting to to introduce those that haven't seen it before. It talks to our connection with Tan Dun, who's a leading Chinese composer, and his relationship with the orchestra. He's an artistic ambassador to MSO, and in that there's a really interesting in this clip an intersection of sort of sense of style and community and culture that I think to me is really emblematic of some of the things that MSO have achieved and the direction that I think things will continue to head in, where he brings together, he was sort of the chef in this performance, where he brought another group hailing from Beijing, Inner Mongolian folk music rock group called Chingaipe, and they combine traditional instruments like the horsehair fiddle and the two-string lute, sort of with a hearty serving of bravado. Their songs incorporate traditional folk lyrics in Mongolian Mandarin, as well as they write their own new works. And this, I guess this performance, this clip with the orchestra, really for me, there was something about it when I saw it, and I wasn't part of the process of making this come to life, but there's something really, uplifting and joyful and free in this as well, to see these cultures coming together in a really interesting way. So here it is.
That was very joyful, as you said. I could keep listening to that. I guess if I could bring everyone back in just to I guess, unpack this a little bit more. And, in terms of whether or not orchestras really are representative of communities. I mean, one of the biggest conversations that's come out of this year outside of the pandemic has been around racial injustice and cultural. And I wonder, in terms of thinking about the relevance of orchestras, how important is it to ensure that, it is, or they are representative of the communities in which they serve? I think about a city like Melbourne, for example. I think the data is almost half of the population of the city either has a parent that was born overseas or themselves are born overseas. And I just sort of think about how important is that in terms of being reflected back into some of these performing arts venues and organizations. Who wants to start with that?
I think it's essential that we recognise where orchestras are at in terms of got the cultural makeup, and I guess where orchestras have come from. And one of the things that I think is interesting to consider and acknowledge with that too is the cultural makeup of an orchestra, both in terms of the performers, but also the company more broadly. And I guess what has led people to find that space and that voice and that opportunity, and a lot of that has to do with the opportunities and access to learning and pedagogy and means as well. And I think this is one of the things too, that for an orchestra to look at that and to think about how it can go on that journey. It is really about looking at how it connects to, I guess, the life cycle that sits around it, in terms of instrumental tradition, but also, I guess, how an orchestra relates to community by who it invites to sort of sit alongside it and to be, effectively to be on stage or to form part of that broader community. I think it is something that certainly for the MSO, one of the key areas is addressing that in a First Nations context, and now that's a very significant step. It's by no means the only step, but it is, I guess, a demonstration that is something that when we embark on it, and this is, I think, something that we recognise as an organisation, is that it's not necessarily up to one person or to think that we as an organisation understand what it is that needs to happen to do that. It's actually about listening, and it's about seeking knowledge and recognising that we need to bring, I guess, cultural, we need to build the collective cultural understanding, but also understanding of cultural authority in this country. And I think they're really, really important things for the orchestra at the moment as well. So it's sort of one of those things that I think we wrestle with. We've got the orchestra comes with a sort of canonic European repertoire, if you like, and that can still carry profound meaning, but it can be overexposed. And I think it needs to be placed in contexts that bring about new meaning and immediacy, rather than saying that we're hanging on to that and retaining that as the definition or the defining element of what an orchestra is. I think it's where we've come from, and we recognise that is a place that has, a rich musical tradition, but we also have to acknowledge and really apply ourselves to the fact that we are in Australia, we are in the 21st century, we are, as you say, a community made up of a tremendous amount of diverse backgrounds, and I think we need to celebrate that and really apply ourselves in that space.
Would you agree with that, Monica?
Yeah, I think there's a few barriers to quick change. The first one is music education in this country and in this state. There's for people to feel okay about engaging with us, then they have to know what and who we are. And currently the state of music education in this country, I'm going to come right out and say it, is not great. It is not great. So, people who have more resources and are born into, better circumstances are going to be the people who come to our concerts and who get jobs in our orchestras. So until in 2005, there was a massive national review of school music education done by the federal government. In 2013, there was the inquiry into the extent, benefits and potential of music education in Victorian schools. In fact, look, I'm going to do a Kaylee McEnany here, and like the kilos and kilos of words. And apparently the federal government one broke the record for the amount of submissions, because that's how much Australians care about music education. But mostly none of those recommendations have been acted upon. So that's point number one. If everybody doesn't have access to this, there should be music in the curriculum. There's instrumental music in the curriculum in Queensland, and that's reflected by the stats. There are more Queenslanders in the Australian Youth Orchestra, more Queenslanders, Maddie, you can back me up here, at the Australian National Academy of Music. There's half of my second violin section in the MSO is from Queensland, and half the wind section as well. So I mean, that's the number one barrier to having proper representation. Like, all children should have, well, I think all arts education, but music education, you know, there's all the stats of how it uses both parts of your brain. And if you put music in the curriculum, the NAPLAN results go through the ceilings, and the VCE retention rates go from 50%, 57% up into the high 90%. You know, I'm preaching to the choir here, I know. But then the second problem, which Maddie really touched on really well, was how we program. And so I think we should always begin with the census, because you yourself told us the statistic of, you know, where we actually are in Melbourne and Victoria, who we serve, to whom we have responsibilities. And I think the programming, and Yaron said it earlier as well, from the outset has to have all the ingredients, so that not a token last minute add-on. You have to embrace the, you know, an educational aspect, some First Nations engagement, access, multiculturalism, and you can build in government relations, corporate partnerships and fundraising, philanthropy in the beginning of the program, which I think Matthew has done incredibly well for next year. I have to say, it's a really big and exciting and encouraging shift. So that's one of our challenges at the moment, just to maybe, you know, and then the other thing that we need is meaningful partnerships that do take a lot of time. In Port Fairy, we threw a party. We threw a party in Port Fairy many months before our first festival. And instead of a fundraiser, it was a friend raiser. And we invited all these people who go above and beyond in the community, people from Rotary, visual artists, unbelievable army of incredible music teachers, choral societies, etc., and got them in a room, an excellent room, the Merry Jig Inn, if you're ever in Port Fairy, it's just magical, and basically asked them what they wanted, what they needed. And I mean, then it was like the boot was on the other foot, and then they all had our contact details, and they all reached out for months and months and months and months, and we're still getting, we've built those relationships. And it really, because you do tend to make assumptions. You can make assumptions about what might be good for people or what they might enjoy, but the only way, as Yaron says, is to spend the time and make the relationships. And these things are slow burn. But I think they're also, what's that word? Exponential. It's like, you know, you sow some seeds, and then all of a sudden in 5 years there's a forest. So that's the way we go about programming Port Fairy. And I think that's a kind of template that's really reflected in what Matthew's done for the MSO next year.
Yaron, just picking up on that, you know, this idea of co-curatorship potentially being the way of the future in terms of engaging community organizations, realistically, in terms of the resources that are required in order to sort of have, you know, this sort of authentic collaboration. How feasible is it when we're talking about sort of the bigger arts organizations in terms of engaging these sort of organizations and having these kinds of conversations that bring about this sort of future that we'd all like to see?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty you tread gently and know that you're probably going to fall quite often. I'm not necessarily a great fan of co-curatorship, because I think there's a kind of dark underbelly, which is a community can become easily a synonym for not very good. And I think that one of the things that needs to be at the center of artistic conversation is artists. And I think that we are far too often witnesses to the will trying to do the work of the imagination. We see people going, it's about this big and it's got a community choir and it's got an Indigenous composer and it's got this and it's going to be at sundown and it's going to be beautiful. You're like, that's not an idea. That's essentially an IKEA package of woke righteousness rather than actually something authentic, deep, meaningful. It might work out, but it might not. And I've done it. We've all done it. We've all kind of gone off the tick list and who's not on the thing. But we need to actually be, our practice as it evolves and catches up and overtakes us, and it's not a linear process, as Monica says, is something that we need to grapple with. And the people who imaginatively can grapple with that are artists. And I use that meaning, you know, I'm in a panel right now with artists, and we can imagine what a future might be that's not on the map, and we can try and make that future happen. And that's the kind of, you know, Promethean act of daring. We steal the fire. It's our job. And so we've got to expect to, you know, bite the hand that feeds us, only, you know, as Nanjun Pike said, not too hard. You've got to kind of push things. And I know that I've engaged a real artist when they come back to me and say, you know, that thing you've just employed me to do, we're not going to do that. We're going to do something a bit different. And I'm like, oh, here we go again. But I also know a little part of me exalts because I know that I've actually hired somebody who's gone, I'm not giving a producer what they want. I'm doing something that comes from a deep inner source. Because ultimately, when you listen to the works, those canonical works that Matthew was talking about that have lasted, they didn't last just because they were written by white blokes in Germany or Austria 150 years ago who were talented. They also lasted. That's part of it in the cultural and other infrastructure. But they also lasted because they were coming from a very deep place inside the artist, and they spoke truths to someone's inner life and their place in the world. And I think that stuff is very easily forgotten when we're, you know, the metaphor that I have is that I imagine that on my blacker days that there's a group of people running down the streets with butterfly nets trying to capture somebody for their arts grant to say, you know, you are a member of such and such demographic, because if we don't have one, we won't get the grant. I think redressing cultural imbalance and historical lack is absolutely essential. I think it's something we have to do, but we have to be on guard that that doesn't take away the centrality of the imagination, the artist, and also sometimes the fact that not everything is better just because it's a community or a collaboration or shares curatorship. Sometimes you just want a blazingly good idea or a great work of art.
But isn't that sort of in some way being dismissive of the power of that kind of representation? And the reason why I say that is I sort of think about my own journey into classical music. You know, I grew up in a working class background. The closest we came to classical music was Vivaldi's Four Seasons. Like, it was just very much stereotypical. And, you know, I had a great education, went to university and was exposed to all manner of things. But I can tell you, every time I went through the arts precinct on St Kilda Road, I would just walk past these monuments, these public spaces that were supposed to be buildings that belonged to me because this is my city. But I always felt very intimidated by them because I sort of thought, one, I didn't have the language, two, I didn't see anyone that looked like me there. But whenever the programming had even a slight reflection of my cultural background, it sort of piqued my curiosity. And I sort of thought, you know what, maybe this is a way for me to get in. And that's kind of how it started for me. I won't lie. And since then it's sort of evolved in that way. I sort of think we're being dismissive in terms of the power of that kind of.
No, so I'm absolutely not being dismissive. I think that broad representation in ways of opening doors, and as Monica said, talking about supporting with education, is absolutely essential. Like, I think it's essential. What I'm saying is that it's easy to reframe it as the end point rather than an essential stream in that conversation. So I don't think we shouldn't do everything we can to make the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra or Circa should look as much as it can like the broadest possible part of the population, as diverse, as interesting, as weird as it can possibly be, and as capacious in our reach. I think that's our duty as cultural leaders, and I think we absolutely take that really seriously, and also acknowledge that we're not there yet, and that there's an awful lot more to do and many more mistakes to be made along the way. But I do think it's easy to reframe that as an end, and the end, I think, is particularly my bugbear, I guess, is removing artists from the center of that conversation. because I think if you don't have the spirit of in artistic creativity and invention alive in all the things you do, right? So then I think what you'll end up with is work that very quickly becomes kind of dry and brittle. It becomes kind of an idea in service of an idea. And that doesn't serve anyone. That's not going to bring you might walk through the door, but there's not going to be anything happening inside. And I reckon after a while you won't. Whereas when we looked at that Tan Dun film clip, I noticed that we all had big smiles on our faces and we were all responding to Tan Dun's an extraordinary artist. That band that I've never heard of are amazing. And I want to be at that concert, even though I know nothing about that culture. And that makes me a better human being and a more culturally rich one. So I think that the aim is to put artists in the middle of that maelstrom and encourage and kind of unleash them to go. And that's where the curatorialship is. And I think it's about actually going, let's leave them in the room and let's lock the door and see what they come up with in a while and give them the resources to do it imaginatively and to break the mold. Because I don't think any of the current structures are producing the results yet that we want to be seeing. I think we want to be going, the world that I imagine, and Monica and Matthew, you can tell me if I'm talking for you, probably looks very different to this one. It's like, this is a kind of, we're a work in I feel like we're a work in progress. I don't know that I want to sell tickets to shows, to audiences who come to festivals, to pay cultural homage to the idea of a thing. I want the immediacy of performance, and I want to break models, not reinforce them.
If I could bring you in, Matthew. So, we get people in the door, we bring in these new audiences. How do we retain them? I mean, what are some of the ways? Monica touched on some of the programming that you've got in plan for next year. So, what are the ways in which you think about retaining these new audiences once you've brought them in?
It's a really interesting question. And I had a conversation with someone earlier today and I said, rather than this goal necessarily of thinking we want to get the same person in 8 times, why not get 8 people in the door once? And there is that's an immense challenge, and it's a long road. And as Yaron said, I think we're at a very interesting point in time with this too, because, and I will come back to the question as well in terms of how, but I think there is something also about, if we talk about it in the context or the form of a symphony orchestra, it's something, what percentage of the population today are engaging with that, and like, how do we need to work as a creative entity and as a group of people who are trying, it's an interesting thing too with this sense of letting the artist have that space, because often we have many artists in that space, but we are often ahead of that. We sort of set up a conversation or an expectation with key artists around them bringing an overarching idea to life in that space and asking artists. And I guess it's perhaps a little bit akin to for Yaron with Circa and the company, like there's a sense of levels of artistry and input as well. So how much the orchestra reflects the community, or how much in its makeup, how much it is the nature of the programming. But I think for me, I sort of feel, and this comes back to what Monica was saying about, I guess, this opportunity to learn, or this idea of education, is that once they're in the room, I think it's about having a conversation that's not necessarily a conversation that you have to know a preordained syntax, like a musical language, or a sense of, I know what a perfect fifth is, or I know what a cadence is. These things, we're no longer in a community where with those who are afforded the privilege of good schooling and a sort of a well-rounded education that included music would have assimilated some aspect of that in their upbringing. So that sort of becomes second nature. I think we have to, it's something where maybe it wasn't necessarily the orchestra's problem of their making, but it's a problem we have. It's something we have to address. And I think that's the thing that we need to sort of think more carefully about. I feel like there's a lot we can do in terms of how we situate a narrative around why it's important to be there. The other thing I wanted to, I guess, touch upon a little bit is that your experience of walking past you know, Hamer Hall, or let's say, you know, one of those places on St Kilda Road? And is it a job to be out of those places more? Is it actually to be out in, you know, and I sort of feel like I've sort of found that these moments where you don't think you're actually going to make connections, or you're not actively or assertively out there to sort of think, I'm going to achieve this today. I find it happens a lot, you know, when we used to fly on planes more, or, you know, at airports, or meeting people and those sorts of things. And then you suddenly find that there are these connections. And I think that's the thing to me for the orchestra about getting people in that space, is that they feel comfortable. They don't feel it's a space that they shouldn't be in or don't understand how to be in. They're not certain, we shouldn't be setting up as certain types of spaces for certain types of people. I think that it's really finding that way. And it might be that it's just to say, well, and in the case of the sort of, I guess, you know, very early part of next year, one of the things that the orchestra is really committed to, and something that really came, and it was driven from conversations with musicians, to say, we have to get out in front of we have to be in the community. And when someone says that, it's the simplest thing in the world from a program perspective to say, okay, we can do that. We'll get out into the outer metropolitan suburbs. We'll be out, we'll go to where these people are. And we'll take the time to understand what it is that an orchestra might mean to them, or could bring value or some sort of impact. So I think it's a really, you know, it's a big sort of 360, you know, three-dimensional kind of thing that we're dealing with. And it does take time, but I think it's really about trying to establish as many connections, and over time that they're authentic and they're deepened. And some of the things that the orchestra are privileged and very fortunate to be able to do in the first half of next year are where we are sort of bringing together a whole lot of longer term connections and established relationships with a number of artists that we're very lucky to bring into the one space together. So we have, you know, and that's, I think it's important to recognize as well. Sort of it's a really interesting sort of web in community in that sense.
We've started getting some audience questions coming through, and one of them is directed to you, Monica, and they're asking, what type of initiatives would you like to see for young children who are passionate yet feel intimidated by the arts?
My experience is that it depends how young, because, like, for example, when I studied in America, we were in a string quartet and we did tons of schools concerts, and we had Mozart and we had Bartok. So our audience in Melbourne really doesn't like Bartok. They tend not to buy tickets, but they love Mozart. You played the Mozart and the Bartok to the little kids. I'm talking primary school age, and they just loved the Bartok. They just responded to it because they hadn't been told that Bartok's kind of a bit scary and complicated, and that Mozart's all nice and pretty. So I think we don't give them enough credit, actually. I think kids are like giant sponges, and you can give them anything and they'll go, yeah, I like that. Or, oh, it sounded like a dog barking. Or, oh, there's a thunderstorm. That they don't think of it. You know, they haven't been schooled. They haven't had that stuff schooled into them yet. They have a much more visceral response. So I just think as long as it's something that's not talking down to them, but just kind of exposing them to something that you think is really cool, then I think you'd be surprised at, how responsive children are and how open-minded they are.
Yaron, do you have any thoughts about, initiatives for young children who are passionate but feel intimidated?
Oh, look, I have exactly the same experience as Monica. I've played Circus to young people and seen them leap out of, almost just post-toddlers leap out of their seats. I think we impose cultural filters based on, as Matthew said, this kind of syntax that we inherit. And I think that's where a lot of cultural oppression and stasis lies. It lies in the kind of it's not the painting, it's the layers of varnish and kind of dust and history over it. And I love the fact that if we kind of peel it away and go, it's just sound, it's just rhythm, it's the stuff that we're all made of and we're hearing in our heartbeats. Let's get that into contact with people. Circus is a great medium for that, but we struggle with how to produce authentic community engagement all the way up. And I tell you, I was standing in an Ivy League university running a community workshop, and we were teaching scarf juggling and hula hooping. And I went, wow, this cannot possibly be a real thing. Because that can't really, an Ivy League university, there's great minds here. how are we engaging with people? And that's really what I mean by, if the artist isn't part of that conversation, you generally just don't come up with interesting enough ways to do it. And that's the hard thing, because it's really hard.
Just staying with that, I mean, there's another question that's asking something that's quite direct to that, and the question is, how do we make spaces that present traditional art forms less intimidating and more accessible to diverse audiences?
So are we talking about, I guess, would we say that the question is that the orchestra is a traditional art form? I'm just sort of thinking about.
That's my interpretation of it. So I'm sort of thinking, you know, this is the understanding that, again, you know, we're talking about centuries of history that have largely excluded certain groups from, in terms of access, and that potentially creates a barrier. And so how do you make it, you know, more accessible? How do you ensure, like I said, you know, someone like me that didn't know anything about it, all of a sudden can also enjoy and be part of that experience?
Shall I go?
Yeah. So sorry, I thought you
sorry, apologies. Well, I think it's trying to understand, first of all, what the barriers are. And I think we need to look at the way, you know, what the barriers around understanding the medium. Is it about its ability to, I guess, you know, meld and take on I guess, fuse a sense that there's something in the work that does speak more specifically and is more respectfully sort of oriented, that it does bring, you know, I think it sort of talks to what we were talking about earlier, is this idea about bringing some of the, you know, bringing traditions alongside and cultures alongside traditions, and actually trying to, you know, authentically situate it so that you know, that anyone in the community in an ideal world could see something that, let's say, the MSO does and goes, I can see a resonance or a reason that I'm drawn to that, or I feel that I would belong there, and I could engage with that. And I think, you know, that's something that is I would, you know, it's a significant challenge, but I think it's one that there's absolutely, you know, there's an absolute acknowledgement that it needs to be addressed. But that's also something that can come around the nature of how you I guess, invite people into that too. And it may be that that starts with a conversation and an experience outside a traditional experience. So if the concertization is the traditional aspect that is somewhat unfamiliar, it's also, I guess, saying, well, we need to think carefully about what that is and why there are presupposed behaviors in these spaces and those sorts of things as well. Like, are there ways for us to set it up that it means you don't walk in and feel like you're conforming to something that doesn't really relate to it? And, you know, I guess that's where I sort of, certain concerts you go to, and I'm not necessarily recognize it's not necessarily from a cultural perspective, but in terms of a sense of community and engagement with music, it's sort of like, you go to some concerts, he's like, why are there seats in this room? We should be dancing. We should be closer to each other. We should be moving around. All of these things are, just an interesting sort of example of this was a very famous conductor in the United States who had, the company had employed cleaners, and they were immigrants, and he was very, he struck up a relationship with these new arrivals. He had a very close relationship, and he thought the best thing I could do for them is to offer them, they were obviously of limited means, I'll offer them some tickets to come to the concert I'm performing in a couple of weeks. He was really elated to do that. He gave them the tickets. They were very grateful. He came really, it was part of our community. We didn't understand what to do. And it's at that point he said, I, as the chief conductor of this orchestra, let the community down because I didn't actually think about the complete sense of being able to bring someone into that space and how to safely bring them into that space. So I think that's something we've got to think about also in that context as well, that it mightn't necessarily, the work mightn't necessarily immediately speak to someone, but I think we shouldn't be sort of putting any barriers there to stop people feeling like it's something that they can't engage with.
Can I just add that I think that Matthew said the two words that struck me deepest and I think are absolutely right are safety and authenticity. And I think if you get those two things, if you make the experience authentic and if you can make the experience a safe one, then you create a kind of a really different sort of conversation.
Yeah. And Monica, just very quickly before we wrap up, picking up on what Matthew touched on and also something that you talked about earlier, this need for music education. I wonder as well, just in terms of the orchestras themselves, should we also be thinking about diversifying the orchestras? You know, is it crucial, you know, for the future to ensure that the representation is also within the organizations and not just about bringing in, you know, diverse audiences into these venues?
Well, just to slightly answer the last question first, I'll just say there's one thing that we've done that I'm really proud of for 100 years, and that's the Maya Music Bowl concerts. I think people with their picnic baskets, I haven't seen anyone have, like, everyone's welcome. It's a huge party. We get tens of thousands of people. And so that's a really nice thing that MSO does. And when you do it, you, with the flies and the 40 degrees and the thunderstorms, you just don't care. And the birds and the dogs barking and the helicopters, you just don't care, because it really feels like you're connected to a whole bunch of Melbourne people who wouldn't normally come. The change that's happened over my 23 years is the amount of movies we do. And again, that's a completely different audience. But to properly answer your question, this new question, I wonder, are you talking about diversity in the players?
Within the organizations as well. I mean, we've talked about the importance of bringing in new audiences, and obviously these audiences being representative of communities, but not a lot has come up in terms of talking about the makeup of these organizations as well. I mean, is that critical in terms of thinking about the future?
Well, one barrier to that, in certainly the player body, is that we do all our auditions completely anonymously. It's completely behind a screen, 100%. You're given a number out of 22 or how many people are going. So that can't be applied there. But it gets back to, sorry to harp on about it, but if everybody had the access to the music education, especially in you know, state government schools, then that would just, it would correct itself. It would right itself. That would just be a thing, you know? Anyway, that's a big panned out look at the ecosystem. But with the models we have for auditions, we can't determine anything, any kind of change like that.
And that's something that's being looked at very closely, in particular in regard to what's going on and the very, very intense dialogue that's happening in the United States. And I think it's really interesting to see, especially hearing from, you know, groups of, you know, Black musicians who are saying, we don't want the screen down. We just want better education. We want access. We want to be afforded. And I think, you know, it's something that I think, you know, I'm certainly very conscious of too. You know, you don't know what you don't know in that sense. So it is about starting to understand that. And I think, you know, an orchestra that did on stage reflect its community is going to be an orchestra that's going to survive and thrive long into the future as well.
I think that's a great point to end tonight's conversation. I could keep talking to all three of you for forever, basically. I mean, this has just been such an enriching conversation. So thank you all for your time, for your insights, and thank you to everyone that's tuned in to this conversation.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Santilla.
Thank you.
Everyone.